the fallout of so much tragedy, more news was coming in, a fourth crashed airliner in Pittsburgh. And somehow American government seemed almost powerless amidst all this. The centers of that power had been evacuated, key congressional leaders taken to secret locations. The president himself whisked to a nuclear bunker in Nebraska, shaken but pledging somehow to find those who masterminded this day of mayhem and massacre.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Hours after the attacks, the United States, the whole world, is struggling to take it all in. There's really no more rescue the firemen can seriously attempt. It's now a question of salvage amid the wreckage, as others in New York try to establish how many men, women and children have been lost. A priest picks his way through the New York ruins. The World Trade Center has been reduced to the stumps of skyscrapers that once helped define one of the world's most vibrant cities, normally loud with life. An entire society feels itself violated by terror. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, Stephen Speech is still with us in Washington. Stephen, President Bush vowing to find those responsible. How on earth do they begin to look?
Well, there are already certainly some suspicions among intelligence officials here. Senator Orrin Hatch, who's a Republican senator, has quoted CIA sources as saying that they are beginning to believe that this was the work of Osama bin Laden and his group. And we've also had other reports that intelligence officials are hardening their suspicions on Osama bin Laden. I mean, that is a start, if that's what they believe. But of course, the investigation is going to go on for several days. And I think if they're wise, the administration of the government will take their time before they come out with any public statements blaming anybody. President Bush was notably cautious in what he said a few hours ago. What he did say, of course, was that there would be the same strong measures taken against those who harbour terrorists as against those who carry out the attacks. So perhaps a hint there of who they believe might have been responsible.
Any indications yet as to how the hijackers managed to take control of the aircraft?
According to the Attorney General John Ashcroft, and indeed according to other reports that we'd already had, it was done with knives. It would have been much harder to smuggle guns on board the 4 aircraft that were hijacked. So it seems that they managed somehow to get knives on board, and they then apparently stabbed some of the flight personnel. This is according to mobile phone calls that were made by passengers who were unfortunate enough to be on the planes. And that was how they managed to get control of the aircraft, which they then flew into the various targets.
And just to reiterate, Stephen, the casualty figures, the casualty estimates we're getting so far sound pretty horrific.
Absolutely. We're talking in New York about possibly thousands of people. That number is still completely unclear, people who were killed within the World Trade Center itself. The New York Fire Force are talking about more than 260 firefighters missing. The police department saying more than 80 police missing, feared dead. 266 people on board the 4 planes. And the latest figure, and one which I think has surprised us here, 800 people believed dead, according to firefighters, inside the Pentagon.
People will be asking, given that this doomsday scenario, if you like, on the terrorist front has been around for a while, people will be asking how on earth security was so lax that it could take place, and how on earth American intelligence failed to see it coming.
Yes, I think there are those 2 angles. One is the immediate question of how the attack took place on US soil. First of all, how the hijackers managed to get knives on board planes. I think there's a lot of questions being asked about the hijacks. Then the question of how the planes were able to hit their targets. I think a little bit more understanding of that to a certain extent, given that there apparently was no knowledge of that this was going to happen. the fact that you have civilian airliners flying low over New York, that is a pretty hard thing to prevent, and indeed there are questions as to whether it would have been within the law to shoot down those civilian airliners, even had the authorities known where they were heading. But I think the big question, you have to take the whole thing further back in time, is about US intelligence not knowing that this thing was going to happen. And indeed, some people are saying that really the US government they should have gone after the people who were going to be plotting this kind of thing a long time ago.
Stephen Speech in Washington, thank you very much.
This is BBC News, a summary now of the main news. President George Bush has acknowledged that thousands of people were killed in the series of attacks in which hijacked airliners were flown deliberately into landmark buildings on Tuesday. Speaking from the White House, President Bush said the victims' lives had been ended by evil. He said world leaders would stand together to win the war against terrorism.
It's a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
He was speaking after consulting his national security advisors about how to respond to the destruction of the World Trade Center in New York and serious damage to the Pentagon in Washington. The two hijacked passenger planes flew directly into the sides of the twin skyscrapers of the World Trade Center during Tuesday morning's rush hour. Both towers caught fire immediately and later collapsed, sending clouds of dust and billowing smoke into Manhattan as people frantically tried to escape.
The police officer told everybody to form a human chain, and we held on to each other, and he flashed the light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
Shortly after the first two strikes, another hijacked Boeing passenger plane crash near the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. The building burst into flames and part of its five-sided structure collapsed. A fourth airliner crashed in Pennsylvania, again after apparently being hijacked. More than 12 hours after the attacks began, the full scale of the loss of life is not known. Nearly 270 people are known to have died in the four hijacked aircraft, and union officials in New York say several hundreds firefighters and policemen disappeared. Many of them are believed dead. In the last few hours, New York's mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, advised New Yorkers to stay away from the city center if at all possible.
It's important and it's critical, then you come to work. But if you can stay home tomorrow, you're going to make things easier on yourself and easier on the city if you stay home. So the city is not officially closed. Manhattan is not officially closed north of 14th Street. But we're advising people if you can stay home, it would be better. Outside of Manhattan, you go to work and do all the things you would normally do. There's no particular reason to be constricted in activities there. But if you can stay out of the city, that would be good.
International leaders around the world have condemned the attacks, among them the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon.
I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil. At this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, completely shocked.
Meanwhile, American forces around the world have been placed on the highest alert and warships have been deployed along the US East Coast. Suspicion has fallen on Islamic militant groups, including those associated with the Saudi exile Osama bin Laden, already wanted by the Americans. The Taliban authorities in Afghanistan, where Mr. bin Laden is based, say he didn't have the capability for such a huge operation. Many world governments have also ordered defense alerts and called emergency security meetings.
Right across the United States, people have been watching in horror the events unfolding in New York, Washington and Pennsylvania. Joining us now live from Portland, Oregon is our correspondent Nick Bryant. Nick, you're on entirely the other side of the country from the scene of these ghastly events. What are people saying there?
Bill, people are looking at these pictures and they still can't believe what they're seeing. People are making the comparison, as you say, with Pearl Harbor, the attack in 1941 which killed about 2,600 people. But this is much, much worse, it seems. And the thing is that people didn't watch Pearl Harbor unfold before their eyes on national television, and that's what happened today. From very early in the morning here on the West Coast, people were gathering around televisions and watching in utter disbelief at the scenes that they were seeing, first of all in New York and then in Washington, D.C. This country has so many divisions, racial, religious, geographic, but at times like this it has a remarkable capacity to come together, and that's what's happening right now on the West Coast in the heartland of America. People feeling a great deal of sympathy with the people of New York and the people of Washington, D.C. and are in a state of complete shock. Never has America seen a day like this.
Nick, we're just going to take a look at the moment at some pictures that we've just got in from the scene in New York, just to bring us up to date with what's happening there. And people in your part of the country will be looking at these as well. The smoke and the dust seem to have settled, but now a major recovery operation will be taking place. Apparently we understand that there may be still some people alive in the wreckage of the World Trade Center and neighboring buildings, but people in Portland will just feel helpless.
Bill, we're hearing reports actually of people in the basement of the World Trade Center making cell phone calls to relatives as far away as Pennsylvania, saying where they are, saying that they're with New York police officers who are still alive, describing exactly where they are so that it will help the rescue effort. So that's the sort of thing that we're hearing coming out of New York. And of course this is a shared national experience which has caused disruption all over the United States. I started off the morning in Seattle there. The highest skyscraper in the city was closed down. The famous Sky Needle, very famous on Seattle's skyline. That was shut straight away. The federal buildings closed immediately. I'm dressed very scruffily. I tried to go to the shops to buy a shirt and a tie to come on TV tonight. I couldn't. The shops are shut. I've been trying to call New York, trying to call Washington. We can't. The phone lines are down. Britain's been trying to call the East Coast of the United States. It can't. Again, the phone lines are down. It's caused disruption all over the United States. People here are stranded. All the airports are shut, and we're not quite sure when they're going to reopen.
Yes, we've just been seeing pictures, in fact, of Midtown Manhattan, which should normally be bustling with people, particularly Times Square, normally absolutely crowded with people, and it was virtually deserted, and lots of stores closed there, of course. President Bush has spoken to the nation a couple of hours ago. Do you think Americans will have taken comfort from his words?
I think they will have, and I think they're right behind him right now. We saw that remarkable bipartisan show on Capitol Hill earlier. Members of the Senate, members of the House of Representatives spilling onto the steps of Capitol Hill, expressing their support for the president, and then joining in a spontaneous rendition of God Bless America. Many people were moved by that. We've also had some instant polling conducted by a number of news organizations over here. The question, do you believe George W. Bush when he says that America has the capacity to hunt down and exact revenge on the people responsible for this attack? 91% of the people polled said that America has that capacity and should go ahead and seek revenge.
Nick Bryant in Portland, Oregon. Thank you very much. Well, as Nick mentioned, President Bush has promised to find those responsible for the attacks and to bring them to justice. Bill Hayton now looks at his options.
The wreckage at the Pentagon is still being cleared and the human cost still being counted. The horror inflicted on bases and embassies around the world over the past 2 decades has now hit America's highest military headquarters. The sheer might controlled from this building has made direct military attacks against the United States all but impossible. Instead, its enemies have turned to so-called asymmetric warfare, small-scale operations with dramatic effects, such as last year's bomb attack in Yemen against the USS Cole.
And I think it's got something to do with the fact that America continues to have their forces in the Middle East. America continues to back tyrant regimes. And I think that this should be a lesson not only for the American regime, but also to the Muslims worldwide, to say that we need to have a different type of relationship.
Washington has responded with court action against those it believes responsible, but also with direct military retaliation.
And I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
When Osama bin Laden's group bombed the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania 3 years ago, killing more than 220 people, the response was dramatic. More than 80 cruise missiles were fired at sites in Afghanistan and Sudan, allegedly connected to his organization. They killed 20 people but missed bin Laden himself. The actual bombers were extradited to the US, and last May 4 men were convicted in New York and sentenced to life in jail. But retaliation doesn't always hit the right targets. In 1986, after 2 American soldiers were blown up in a Berlin nightclub, US planes bombed Libya, though it was later suggested that Syrian agents had been responsible. And Washington is being sued for millions of dollars by a businessman whose Sudanese factory was destroyed by a cruise missile after it was wrongly linked to bin Laden.
If they reflect on these questions, and if they look at the source of the resentment in the Arab world and Muslim world, I believe there wouldn't be any attack. But sending cruise missile, it wouldn't solve the problem. It will maybe fuel more problems to the American and to the whole international community.
The USS Enterprise is sailing to join another carrier group in the Gulf, projecting American power into the heart of the Middle East. But political leaders must now decide whether using that power makes further attacks more or less likely in the future. Bill Hayton, BBC News.
Well, with me here in the studio is our diplomatic correspondent, Mike Wooldridge. Mike, expressions of shock and sympathy from many nations around the world, most nations, but not from all. What next?
It will depend, I suppose, on whether the level of condemnation that we're hearing now, and it is across a very wide front. I mean, there are perhaps unlikely nations joining in the language that we're hearing about these particular attacks, whether that does translate itself into more of a concerted international effort to deal with the issue of terrorism. We've heard this sort of rhetoric, if you like, before, of course, after previous attacks on a lesser scale. The issue would be whether the nature of these particular attacks does bring about a global effort that actually then has some more concrete action about it that could deal with terrorism in the way of perhaps joint action between security agencies and so on. This is the sort of practical step forward that's been suggested by a number of countries that have always considered themselves to be in the forefront of the fight against terrorism, countries like Russia, countries like India and so on.
Yes, because we were reporting earlier that the Petronas Twin Towers in Kuala Lumpur, the tallest buildings in the world, were evacuated after some kind of bomb threat. So any country with a large building on its territory must feel particularly vulnerable now.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we have a world on edge now, don't we? And as I say, I think that the question will be whether in the short term, of course, there is to be any kind of retaliation, any kind of reprisals by the United States. Of course, there may well be a mood in favor of that within the country. Wasn't really, of course, clear from President Bush's address whether that might actually take place, though importantly he did talk about drawing no distinction between those involved in terrorism and those who host terrorists. Maybe we could read some clues into that. If there were to be retaliation of some kind, anything on the lines of what we saw in 1988, the cruise missile attacks against Afghanistan, the attack against Sudan after the embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, whether that might in fact turn out to be counterproductive for the United States, whether that might then undermine an attempt to get a more globally agreed approach. These, I think, will be the key issues in the coming days and weeks.
Because the problem surely is that from all these hijackings, any evidence linking them to any particular group will have been obliterated in the explosion. So any proof would only be circumstantial.
Precisely, and of course, to be able to mount this kind of orchestrated operation inevitably involves a very shadowy network anyway, to be able to put it into effect and, if you like, fool the world's intelligence agencies, as seems to have happened here. Inevitably, this is a very amorphous nebulous thing that we're dealing with here. It makes it all the more difficult, of course, even if there were to be a new strategy on terrorism that were to be agreed between a large number of the world's nations. Would it necessarily be any more effective in the long term? Very often these debates appear to be going in one direction, and of course they break down on the issue of those who say what you've actually got to address is the roots of terrorism as well as the mechanics of it. That's the other sticking point very often in the past.
It's being suggested that this has come about, these incidents have come about because of intense hatred in certain parts of the world about the United States policy on the Middle East. But that policy is hardly likely to change now, is it?
We would assume not, I think. And whether it is singly about that, of course, is another issue. And of course, at the moment, this is all still in the realm of speculation, whether the Middle East is the fulcrum of all this. I mean, there are others suggesting that this is a much bigger platform, if you like, for the terrorists who've been involved in this, that it is much more anti-Western, anti-capital and so on, in addition to whatever also may be particular issues of the Middle East or indeed any other specific region of the world.
Mike Waldridge, thank you very much. Let's go to New York now. We can get the latest situation from our correspondent Steve Evans, who was in fact in one of the World Trade Center buildings when the first explosion took place. Steve, first of all, can you bring us up to date on the situation downtown?
The situation is that the rescue work continues. There are artificial lights up. Many of the streets of Manhattan have been closed off so that ambulances can go from the tip of Manhattan, where the World Trade Center was is the important word, out to the hospitals. Buses are being used here to ferry people. There are some casualty figures coming out. It is estimated that at least 200 firefighters are thought to have been crushed as these two buildings collapsed. Something like nearly 100 police officers are also thought to be missing. When I was down there, what was noticeable was the emergency services arrived swiftly and in force. About a half an hour after the explosions, there were lines of ambulances in the streets immediately underneath the World Trade Center. Nobody thought that those buildings were going to collapse. What has clearly happened is that those buildings did collapse. We know that, and they collapsed on many of the people who'd arrived there to rescue the people who the people who'd been injured in the initial explosions. After those collapses, you saw lots of firefighters absolutely caked in dust. They looked like moon-like figures. It's the only way of describing it. Now, those were the lucky ones. Those were the ones who got away. Clearly, an awful lot of those emergency workers didn't get away. We can't estimate what the final death toll will be. There are clearly the people involved in the initial incidents, if that's not too kind a word to use, and then many people then caught as those buildings fell.
Steve, we were looking just a second ago at pictures, nighttime pictures of New York, and the streets largely deserted in some parts of town, even in Midtown, and also shelves in a store largely swept clear of food. Is there a sense of panic still in Manhattan?
I don't think panic is the word, you see. It is eerie. It's almost heart-lifting, if you can have anything heart-lifting in this kind of circumstance. The shops closed almost in sympathy. A lot of shops closed. An awful lot of people simply got out of town, but quite a lot of people simply stood around ruminating about this thing. I was in Times Square a short time ago, and Times Square is normally, it calls itself the crossroads of the world. It is normally teeming with people right through the day and night. And there are small groups of people there looking up at the electronic ticker tape, which is giving the latest information. And they were quiet, but they were also angry. And it has to be said that the word vengeance was being used. The people I talked to, a few individuals, but the people I talked to, all said they hadn't been impressed by President Bush 24 hours ago, but in the speeches he's made since the bombings this morning, they are now impressed, and they were basically saying that whatever he wants to do, that he would get their support. The networks here are talking about America under attack. They're talking about it being like Pearl Harbor. They're talking about an event that galvanized a people. various people have been talking about vengeance, about revenge, not just on the people whose hands have almost literally got blood on them, but the people who harbour those people. There is certainly an appetite in this city for some kind of military action.
Stephen Evans in New York, thank you very much.
This is BBC News, a summary now of the main story. President George Bush has acknowledged that thousands of people were killed in the series of attacks in which hijacked airliners were flown deliberately into landmark buildings on Tuesday. Speaking from the White House, President Bush said the victims' lives had been ended by evil. He said world leaders would stand together to win the war against terrorism.
It's a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
The devastation began when two hijacked passenger planes flew directly into the sides of the twin skyscrapers of the World Trade Center during Tuesday morning's rush hour. Both towers caught fire immediately and later collapsed, sending clouds of dust and billowing smoke into Manhattan as people frantically tried to escape.
The police officer told everybody to form a human chain, and we held on to each other, and he flashed the light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
Shortly after the first two strikes, another hijacked Boeing passenger plane crashed into the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. The building burst into flames and part of its five-sided structure collapsed. A fourth airliner crashed in Pennsylvania, again after apparently being hijacked. More than 14 hours after the attacks began, the full scale of the loss of life is not known. Nearly 270 people are known to have died in the four hijacked aircraft, and union officials in New York say several hundreds of firefighters and policemen have disappeared. Many of them are believed dead. US government sources say 800 people died in the Pentagon alone. In the last few hours, New York's Mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, advised New Yorkers to stay away from the city center if at all possible.
It's important and it's critical, then you come to work. But if you can stay home tomorrow, you're going to make things easier on yourself and easier on the city if you stay home. So the city is not officially closed. Manhattan is not officially closed north of 14th Street. But we're advising people if you can stay home, it would be better. Outside of Manhattan, you go to work and do all the things you would normally do. There's no particular reason to be constricted in activities there. But if you can stay out of the city, that would be good.
International leaders around the world have condemned the attacks, among them the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon.
I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil. At this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, completely shocked.
Meanwhile, American forces around the world have been placed on the highest alert and warships have been deployed along the US East Coast. Suspicion has fallen on Islamic militant groups, including those associated with the Saudi exile Osama bin Laden, already wanted by the Americans. The Taliban authorities in Afghanistan, where Mr. bin Laden is based, say he didn't have the capability for such a huge operation. Many world governments have also ordered defense alerts and called emergency security meetings.
Well, why did it happen and what happens next? Earlier, I spoke to Jonathan Clark, Research Fellow in Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Research Institute, who's an expert on American foreign policy, and Anjem Choudary, leader of the British political party Al Muhajirun, which attracts young British Muslims with its own brand of radical ideas. Mr. Chowdhury says although everyone's deeply sorry for the victims and their families, it's no surprise that the United States has become a target.
We regret the loss of any innocent lives, whether we be Muslims or Christians. This is something which is unacceptable. Those people who are not involved in war, who are not perpetrating any violence anywhere in the world, they do not deserve to be targeted. However, we can get an indication of the feeling of the Muslims worldwide by the fact that if you go to Baghdad or you go to Jerusalem today, you'll find that people are celebrating in the streets. That will indicate to you that there is a feeling of retribution or revenge against American atrocities being committed at the present time in the Middle East.
American atrocities?
American atrocities being committed. For example, their continued support of the tyrant state of Israel, the continuing bombing of Iraq, the unilateral bombing indeed a few years ago of Sudan and Afghanistan. We have a long list of atrocities which America have committed, which are enough for the Muslims and the Islamic movements worldwide to consider that they are in fact in a state of war with the American government.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, it seems this has come about because it's payback time for America's foreign policy.
Yes, that may be the case, but I think one of the things that does stand out today has been the number of messages flowing in from the Arab world, from all over the Arab world, and from Mr. Arafat himself, deploring this incident, condemning this as an outrage, and really dismissing any participation in this by the Palestinians. So I think that's an encouraging sign.
Anjem Choudhury with us here in the studio. This is just a surely solitary act by a group of extremely radical fanatics who have no real base of support anywhere in the world.
I don't think that's the case at all. I think that the
well,
regimes...
you just heard, but hang on a second, Mr. Jonathan Clark just said, pointed to the number of messages of condolence that have come in from Middle Eastern nations.
But the Middle Eastern nations are run by tyrant regimes, and they have dictators who have nothing at all to say about Islam, and they don't base their policies upon the divine text. Those people who represent the views of the Muslims and Islam worldwide are those legitimate scholars, and fatwa have been issued, for example, by the Sharia courts of the UK today, that American military personnel and buildings and war machinery remains and has been, up until today, a legitimate target because of atrocities which they have been committing.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, do you think this appalling attack is going in any way to change America's policy towards the Middle East?
Well, I think what is going on right now is a period of rational and calm reassessment. The United States policy in the Middle East has been very consistent for over a large number of administrations. I very much doubt that it's going to change in the face of this outrage. But clearly what you are going to be seeing is inside the American government a reconsideration of American foreign policy around the world. But I don't think you're going to see dramatic changes, especially not in the face of this type of provocation.
Anjem Choudhury, it's not going to change anything. Thousands of people will have died for nothing.
I think that whoever was behind the actions which took place today are not really the focus point for us. I think what we need to do is we need to look to why people are targeting American interests. Why have people taken the stance that we need to attack the Pentagon, we need to attack the political and the economic and the strategic locations, and really inflict damage upon the American government. And I think it's got something to do with the fact that America continues to have their forces in the Middle East. America continues to back tyrant regimes, and I think that this should be a lesson not only for the American regime but also to the Muslims worldwide, to say that we need to have a different type of relationship, a relationship based on debate and discussion.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, is America going to learn the sort of lesson that Mr. Choudhury wants it to?
I think he's rather exaggerating the present relations between the United States and the Arab world. Generally speaking, these are very good. If you think about relations with countries like the Gulf Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, with Kuwait, I think with Egypt, you see a very great sign of friendship and solidarity with those nations. There are obviously major disagreements over Israel, but I think that overall the relationships with the Arab world are good, and they're not going to change as a result of this. So I wouldn't take this out of perspective in terms of American foreign policy. I really wouldn't. I think that this is going to continue in the way that American foreign policy towards the Middle East has been set for a great number of administrations.
Well, joining me now from Washington is James Woolsey, director of the CIA from 1993 and until 1995. Mr. Woolsey, what went wrong?
Well, we don't know for sure. Clearly this was not picked up, and it was a terrible tragedy. American intelligence has been successful in stopping a number of terrorist incidents back around the time of the year 2000 and the like.
You had warnings,
you have to stop them all.
You had warnings, didn't you?
It's hard to say. They may well have had warning that something generally bad was going to happen, but certainly not enough specific warning to realize it was going to be something like this. You remember a few weeks ago, we had to cancel some military exercises in the Mideast and put some ships to sea in the Persian Gulf to get them away from potential terrorists. There was a lot of talk then that something major might happen, but this may well have been what that talk was about.
Do you think you've been too busy worrying about Russia and missile defense systems?
No, I don't think that's the focus. That has very little to do with really most of what the intelligence community does these days. I think the major problem really was that for the 8 years of the Clinton administration, most of the bureaucracy got used to, under the administration's lead, to assuming that terrorism was either conducted by sort of loose associations of people who came together for a specific event, or by Osama bin Laden, or one of the major terrorist groups, but they did not look hard at state sponsorship. And this operation may have been sophisticated enough that people may now start to look hard at whether a government such as possibly Iraq, which is the one government that has praised this undertaking, may be involved. I think the Clinton administration did not look closely enough at that possibility, and hopefully the Bush administration now will.
Well, you seem to be blaming the Clinton administration. Surely Bush's stance and his isolationist stance and his siding with Israel, for example, should have alerted people to hostility in the Arab world at least, if not elsewhere, even in your own backyard.
Well, the hostility from the Arab world has been around for a while. I don't agree that President Bush is isolationist. I think that it's not certain that this attack came from the Arab world or the Mideast, although it seems to be a strong possibility given all of the circumstances, and particularly given the similarity to two previous operations that Ramzi Yousef, the mastermind of the World Trade Center bombing, who's in prison out in Colorado, conducted. The World Trade Center bombing itself in '93, and an effort to blow up a number of American airliners in the Pacific a year or two later. If, as some of us have been suggesting, there's a chance that Yousef was involved with Iraqi intelligence, that would also suggest that we should take a very hard look, certainly not proven yet, but we should at least take a look at whether there could have been Iraqi involvement in this as well.
We saw earlier John Ashcroft giving a web address for the CIA. Has he had any response from intelligence services around the world yet?
I don't know. I'm a private citizen and have been for 6.5 years, so I don't know.
But would you imagine that he's calling around, for example, and trying to get some indication of who might have caused this?
Well, certainly the intelligence services with whom we work closely on matters of this type, British, Israeli, and others, and some of the moderate Arab states, would have long ago, I think, have given us anything that they could have picked up that would have been potentially indicative of something like this coming. But after the fact, one has to go back and comb through every last detail and see whether or not anything was missed, and if so, what was missed, and to try to put the pieces together. There's a good chance that, as some of the leaks now here in this town are suggesting out of the White House, that bin Laden's group was involved, but that does not mean that they exclusively were involved. It is at least possible that there was a state sponsorship behind them.
So what do you think the CIA and the other intelligence agencies will have learned from this?
Well, one thing I hope they learned is that some guidelines that were adopted by the CIA, I hasten to say after I left, in response to a political issue here involving Guatemala, may have been most unwise. Those guidelines make it difficult, not impossible, but more difficult than it should be, to recruit spies inside organizations if those individuals have some violence in their background. Well, that may be well and good if you're recruiting spies inside hostile governments. There are a lot of good people trapped inside bad governments. But inside terrorist organizations, the only people there are human rights violators. They're people who want to be terrorists. So if you only recruit nice people as spies, you're not going to learn a lot about what's going on inside terrorist organizations. I think some of those types of guidelines that the CIA operates under now will get a second look. I hope a tough second look.
James Woolsey in Washington, many thanks for joining us. Well, evidence from people who died on several of the hijacked aircraft is being compiled by the FBI as it begins its investigation into the attacks. The American Attorney General, John Ashcroft, says a passenger on the plane which crashed into the Pentagon rang her husband twice on her mobile phone. She's reported to have said that hijackers armed with knives took control of the airplane. The FBI has been handed a recording of a conversation between emergency service controllers and a passenger who reported a hijacking on board the 4th airliner, which crashed in Pennsylvania. The controllers lost contact with the man shortly after he reported an explosion and the cabin filling with smoke. Sometime later, eyewitnesses on the ground saw the airliner flying low, upside down, and with its undercarriage retracted before it crashed into a wooded field. An American senator says the FBI is also examining tapes of conversations allegedly between the hijackers and their controllers. Well, worldwide condemnation of the attacks has been swift, and so too have been the denials of guilt. Those responsible will have had money and resources available to only a few terrorist organizations, and the focus of the investigation into America's worst breach of security will inevitably fall on Islamic and extremist groups. As George Eakin reports, it'll be those responsible for previous attacks on US interests around the world who'll come under closest scrutiny.